our next presenter is from a company that I absolutely adore, even if they do employ Jason Lengsdorf. I use them all the time. Netlify is really incredible. It's every developer's best friend when they want to get things up quickly, reliably, automatically. Really a great functionality there. And Brittney Postma, coming from Michigan, is a developer experience engineer there. She is a self-taught developer, which is really kind of amazing. I had a hard enough time being a stay-at-home dad with two kids who were already 6 and 8 when I met my wife. I don't know how you managed to do this, but it is incredibly impressive that you have. 3 kids and doing all of this, focusing on family, careers, Discord communities that helped you get here. Brittney, I don't know how you do it, but it's kind of amazing. Thank you for taking the time.
I kind of do all the things. Yeah. I have a slide even about like how that went for me. So watch out for that because it's pretty funny.
That's great. Well, we're thrilled to have you here today. So I'm just going to be quiet and get out of the way and let you get on with things. I can't wait to see what you have to say.
I'm so excited too. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Today we are talking a little bit about starting with Svelte, but first a little about me and my journey to finding Svelte. My name is Brittney Postma. You can find me pretty much anywhere around the web at Brittney Postma. I work for Netlify as a developer experience engineer. What does that mean? That means I get to work closely with our engineering teams on Netlify products, making sure that they have a great developer experience. I also get to create fun content around the Jamstack ecosystem, like these podcasts you might have heard me on, Svelte Radio, Coding Cat Dev Podcast, and Remotely Interesting. I'm also the co-founder of the Svelte Sirens, a group in the Svelte community for women, non-binary people, and allies, where we do monthly talks and live streams on Svelte, giving them a safe space to be a part of the community. I'm a mom of 3, and when my kids were really young, I decided to try and teach myself to code. I don't know what I was thinking. This was clearly going to take some time. And it did. About 4 years later, I got my first job in the industry as a software engineer with Grainger, a Fortune 500 e-commerce company. We were building out a new design system in Svelte and using micro front ends to improve the speed and user experience of Grainger.com. Svelte was vetted for 2 months against other powerhouses in the industry, including React, Vue, and Angular. A small representative app was built in each framework and was then voted on by 2 committees. Svelte was chosen for its performance, integrated styling and state solutions, no runtime dependencies, and its simple API with familiar syntax. Size in kilobytes was also a large factor. Svelte's bundle size is massively smaller than other frameworks' baseline. It also maintains higher performance by avoiding a virtual DOM and using vanilla JavaScript to interact and update elements. These are the Lighthouse audit scores, and higher is better. Svelte is also written with less code for the same output in equivalent frameworks. Lines of code isn't always the best metric, but it means a smaller, easier to read code base that can lead to less bugs and less technical debt. The order history team at Grainger was able to create the fastest time to market from concept to creation in Grainger's 100-year history. Being able to write in a familiar syntax, we were able to quickly onboard new developers and jump straight into creating products that help our customers. Our productivity soared. We know other companies are using Svelte too, like Alaska Airlines, Square, and Philips. IBM has a version of their carbon design system built in Svelte, and the New York Times, where the creator of Svelte, Rich Harris, used to work as a graphics editor. He created Svelte to keep up with their fast-paced needs in the newsroom to develop highly interactive sites like the COVID tracker and the models for the Olympic races. We can also see Svelte being used on the beta version of Apple Music at beta.music.apple.com and on ikea.com. According to the developers that filled out the most recent State of JavaScript survey, people really love using Svelte too. Svelte had the highest retention scores along with Solid.js, and the largest number of developers had interest in learning Svelte. It comes down to providing a great developer experience. So what if I told you that you can learn the JavaScript fundamentals while using a modern framework, prototype quicker, and scale up projects all the way to the enterprise level? Starting with Svelte is a win-win. It's an enjoyable developer experience that doesn't compromise on the user experience. Some of you may have heard of this podcast called Syntax FM. A co-host of the show, Wes Boss, is one of the other speakers at this conference. Scott Talinsky has talked over and over again about how much he loves Svelte. And now he's even convinced Wes to see the beauty of Svelte. Scott runs leveluptutorials.com, where they created monthly tutorial courses with a subscription-based model. The site had been iterated on since 2015 through several React updates and attempts to get server-side rendering working. Last year, their team needed to do a full rewrite, so it was a great time to reevaluate Svelte. The previous stack, Vite, React, and Fastify, hadn't worked with SSR, and even converting to Next.js to get that would have been a considerable rewrite. Since Scott already loved Svelte, he thought it was time to test its limits. 3 months later, the team had rewritten hundreds of components, removing years of technical debt and cutting out a lot of bulk. The entire site was running on SvelteKit, the meta framework for Svelte. They were able to remove extra libraries that Svelte provides out of the box and ship less JavaScript to the user. Framer motion was replaced with Svelte transitions that use and extend CSS transition functionality. Styled components was replaced with Svelte scope styling and CSS custom properties. Redux was replaced with Svelte stores, a way to manage global state. Apollo was replaced with a regular fetch call to a GraphQL endpoint. And finally, React Helmet was replaced with a native Svelte head component. They saw a huge reduction in code, and the team loved the developer experience. Let's look at how Svelte takes care of so many of those libraries. Transitions and animations come out of the box with Svelte. They can be applied with the transition : and then the name of the transition. Applied only to an in or an out state, or customized with properties or a function. We can see in the video how each one behaves a little differently. Some frameworks require importing CSS modules or another library to scope styles, but CSS in Svelte is scoped to a component by default by adding a class to affected elements, which is based on a hash of the component styles in the output. The built-in Svelte stores are readable, writable, and derived, and they offer a way to provide global state management. They're an object with a subscribe method. Here, I've created a writable store for count, a read-only readable store, and a derived store based on the count store value called double count. You could manually subscribe to the values, but Svelte provides a simple $ syntax to reference a store's value in the markup. Import the stores, use them in the markup, and they all stay in sync with the UI. The biggest takeaway for Scott and the team was, when you have to make fewer tech choices, you can focus on what really matters for your users. Svelte provides a best-in-class tutorial at svelte.dev/tutorial that walks you through everything that is specific to Svelte. Running through the entire tutorial takes around 2 to 3 hours to complete. This allows you to learn the Svelte parts quickly and start building apps faster. And the team is working on learn.svelte.dev, a new full-stack application built on web containers that will take you from beginner Svelte all the way through advanced SvelteKit. Let's take a look at a basic counterexamples in HTML, React, and Svelte. The Svelte files look very similar to the HTML file. The JavaScript is in a script tag, and the markup doesn't need a wrapper function and takes care of all the DOM manipulation behind the scenes. This is because it's a superset of HTML that allows you to write more declarative, dynamic statements without all the boilerplate code. The Svelte and React files both have functions to update the value of count, but in Svelte, variables are kept reactive by assignment without needing a setter function. A gotcha sometimes in Svelte is that array and object methods don't natively trigger Svelte's reactivity because they don't reassign the variables, so Svelte has no way to track it. This can be avoided with either assigning it again or using spread syntax to tell Svelte to update the variable. The biggest difference between Svelte and other popular component frameworks is that Svelte is, before anything else, a compiler. This means it doesn't have some of the same limitations other frameworks have, like the virtual DOM and large runtime libraries. Compilation works by taking the source code you write and parsing it into an abstract syntax tree, or AST. Svelte then traverses the AST to track all of the variables declared, their references, and their dependencies. A new component is rendered with either the DOM renderer for client-side or the SSR renderer for server-side rendering. And then the code is generated by the renderer into vanilla JavaScript and CSS that is consumed by the bundler Vite. If you're interested in learning more about the Svelte compiler, the Svelte docs dives into exactly what runs behind the scenes of it all. Svelte also runs on Vite, a build tool that uses ESBuild and extends Rollup's plugin interface to provide instant server starts, bundling, and generate lightning-fast builds. It was created by Evan You, the creator of Vue. Vite has taken over the modern framework ecosystem as the default choice and can be used in nearly every framework. Svelte and SvelteKit are just Vite plugins that can be added to a Vite config file. With Svelte, you can write components in a very concise, expressive, and developer-friendly way, while still resulting in an incredibly efficient application for your users. In the script tag, there's a regular JavaScript assignment and a special reactive assignment that begins with a strange $:: syntax, but it quickly becomes familiar. This tells Svelte to re-render and keep in sync the variable double when something it depends on changes, in this case, count. It turns the declarative code you write into imperative native JavaScript that updates the DOM directly with small runtime helper functions generated by the compiler from the code you write. This means bundles are smaller, which means faster download and startup times, and newer frameworks like Solid.js are now bringing this approach to JSX. Svelte and SvelteKit also do a compile time accessibility check to help you provide an accessible app by default. While these warnings are extremely helpful for catching markup issues like ARIA attributes, alt attributes on images, and tab index, many issues can only be discovered at runtime, like color contrast. Svelte gives you a good foundation to work with, but you're responsible for taking it the rest of the way and making your app accessible to your users. So how do we scale Svelte and make production-ready applications? This is the time to bring in a meta framework. Other meta frameworks like Next.js, Nuxt, and Gatsby, along with SvelteKit, build on their underlying frameworks. SvelteKit takes a base framework like Svelte and adds more functionality like routing, backend connections that allow for full-stack development, loading data from a server and hydrating it, different rendering methods like static site generation and server-side rendering and client-side rendering, and preparing a production-ready application for deployment. Where Svelte is a client-side SPA or single-page app framework, SvelteKit is the fastest way to build your full-stack Svelte applications. The goal with SvelteKit is to have a single recommended path for building everything from high-performing web apps to static blog pages. Out of the box, you get directory-based routing, code splitting and hot module reloading with Vite, the ability to turn off client-side rendering and send 0 JavaScript to the client, choosing rendering methods based on the route, and adapters for deploying to serverless and edge platforms. At Svelte Summit in Stockholm last September, SvelteKit announced it is in a release candidate phase. Look at how happy Rich is. That confetti gun was so scary, but it was a great time. So what does release candidate mean? It's fairly stable and the team doesn't expect more breaking changes, not saying that there aren't going to be any, but they don't expect any. And it's almost feature complete, but not quite ready for 1.0. You can create a new SvelteKit app locally by running npm create svelte. This prompts a CLI that allows you to configure type checking, ESLint, Prettier, and testing with Playwright automatically if you wish. You can also choose between the demo app, a skeleton project, or a library that you can use to create packages and then be published to npm. Another option to quickly get started is SvelteKit.new. StackBlitz will spin up the demo app right in the browser. Let's check out the demo and look at the project structure. If you run the CLI and choose TypeScript, ESLint, Prettier, and Playwright, this is the demo application folder structure. The root holds all of the config files, the README and generated node modules and .SvelteKit folders. There's also a base app folders for test and static assets. All of the application files live in the SRC folder, where we have the HTML template file, a lib folder for any library code, and the routes directory for the pages of your application. The app.html file is the base template of the application. SvelteKit injects the head component and body into the template at compile time. The lib directory is where we put any library code for the application. These files can be packaged up with a Svelte package command to bundle them for publishing to NPM. In the demo app, there's also images inside the lib directory. These are imported into pages of the application, and Vite gives them hashed file names. These names only get regenerated when the images change, so it speeds up build times and allows them to be processed by plugins for optimization. The public and static directories are skipped from this process, so only put files there you don't want to be hashed. The routes directory is where all of the pages for your application live, along with any single-use components alongside the routes and global CSS file. You might notice at first a strange but important plus prefix on some files. These tell the SvelteKit router to add these as new routes, while unprefixed files like counter and header get ignored. Let's take a closer look at these files. Plus layout.svelte is, as the name suggests, a layout file that wraps the entire routes directory unless it's overridden. In the script tag, it is importing the header component and the global CSS file. In the markup, there's a wrapper div simply for styling purposes, the header component, and then a main section with a slot on line 10. The slot is what tells Svelte where to put any children of this file. Since this is a layout file, it will place any other plus page.svelte file inside of that slot. And then finally, the footer is below. And if you scroll down, we can see some styles that are scoped only to this layout file. So these are only applied in this file. Layout files follow the same hierarchy as your routes directory by default, but they can be overridden or expanded on with advanced layouts. Check out more in the docs. You can also see other plus pages at the root. These are the home page and the data endpoint for that. Other route files for about and Svelte, which is a Wordle clone, are nested in their own folders. The root plus page.svelte file is what appears on the home route of the application inside the layout. Subsequent pages need to be inside of the new directory like we saw with about and Svelte. Here in the script tag, there's a counter component imported and the images we talked a bit about earlier. Because these are imported, they'll be hashed by Vite and be cached until they change. They're imported with a $sign alias to the lib folder. By default in SvelteKit, that is set up to the $sign directly to the lib folder, but it can be configured in the Svelte config file to another symbol or a directory. Another new section here is the Svelte head component. This will be injected into the head section we saw in the template file at compile time. By default in SvelteKit, pages are rendered on the server and then hydrated in the browser for client-side navigation. To load data to a page or specify certain configurations to an endpoint file is needed. Either a plus page.ts or a plus page.server.ts file that only runs on the server is used. The .server file name convention can also be used to hold files on the server, like words.server.ts here. Configurations like pre-rendering a route and only turning on client-side rendering for dev mode can be added to any endpoint or layout endpoint file to configure the whole application. The about route doesn't need any JavaScript, so the CSR can be turned on only for dev mode, so no JavaScript is loaded on this route in production. It can also be pre-rendered at build time since it doesn't need to get any data dynamically. Often data needs to come from the server to render in the UI. This can be done in any of the data routes that end in JS or TS. This is a kind of a contrived example, but hopefully it shows the functionality. I added a load function to the about plus page.ts file on the left and returned a title and a description. In the about plus page.svelte file on the right, two things need to be explained. Svelte uses an export keyword to declare a prop. Component props work the same way. Now the data part is a bit of SvelteKit magic. The data object is automatically loaded off of the return statement in the page.ts file, and it's how all data is passed from the server to the client. Other properties can then be pulled off of it. I placed them into a Svelte head component on lines 7 and 8. And we can see the output in the head section. Title and content for /about goes here. We've talked a lot about SvelteKit and some of the basics of how it works. Now I want to talk about actually getting your app live and up and running. There are many ways and places that a SvelteKit app can be deployed, and the way SvelteKit handles that is through adapters. By default, Adapter Auto is installed. Under the hood, Adapter Auto will attempt to detect the platform that you're hosting on and then install that platform's adapter. Currently, the Adapter Auto has support on static platforms, Cloudflare Pages, and Azure Static Web App, and on serverless platforms, Netlify and Vercel. On the serverless platforms, any files that run on the server get transformed into serverless functions. On top of these adapters, there's also an adapter static for deploying completely pre-rendered or static site-generated pages, applications, and adapter node to generate a node server. Each adapter can be configured with their own set of options as well. If you want to use the newer Edge technology, the specific adapter needs to be installed, since Auto doesn't look at that configuration. Let's install the Netlify adapter and create a new route to use with Edge functions. The Netlify adapter can be installed by running npm i-v for dev dependency and @svelte.js/adapter-netlify. And then replacing Auto with Netlify in that Svelte config file. Configuration options can be set in the adapter property below. Split will allow you to split each route into a separate function so you can see each route in its own function, but it's only available with serverless functions. Either Edge or Split can be true, but not both. Switching Edge to true will convert your app to use Netlify's Edge functions, which run on Dino rather than a node-based server, and puts your function closer to your users. Dino is an alternative to Node.js that provides a secure runtime with first-class TypeScript support. It is secure by default with no access unless explicitly enabled. Dino focuses on web platform functionality and implements web platform standards like ES modules and the native Fetch API. Netlify chose Dino for its Edge network for those reasons. You can use it the same way you do Netlify's other serverless capabilities in all modern frameworks, but Edge functions serve them from the CDN server closest to your user. You can modify network requests with custom headers, read and store cookies, serve content based on the user's location, and more. You can write Netlify Edge functions the standard way as well, but SvelteKit passes access to the Dino context directly into a server endpoint through the event.platform object. I'll create a new directory named Edge inside of routes and then create a pluspage.server.ts file for the server side and the pluspage.svelte file for the UI. In the pluspage.server.ts file, create a load function with an event param. We export that load function, and then I've console logged the event.platform.context. And then returned some data called Edge, grabbing the geo.city off of the context object provided by Dino. TypeScript is mad here because the context object doesn't exist locally. However, once it's deployed, localization is working at the edge. In the pluspage.svelte file, bring in the data object with export let data and render hello from data.edge in the UI. Now that the code is implemented, we can deploy the site. Make sure you have a Git provider set up and your code pushed, and you can, of course, use the prompts on the website if you want to. But I like to use the GitHub CLI and the Netlify CLI for this part to avoid switching context out to my browser. GH repo create will create a new repository for me, and NTL init or Netlify init will link it to a Netlify site and deploy without leaving my command line. A few seconds later, my site is live and personalization at the edge is working. I live in Holland, Michigan, so the Deno edge function is detecting that and passing my city through the context object. If we look over in the edge functions log in the Netlify dashboard, we can see the entire context object that we consoled in the pluspage.server.ts file. These are all the options you can use to customize your site for your users. Check out more about them and use cases in the Netlify docs and how to use them with other frameworks. So let's recap. Svelte is batteries included. Transitions, animations, scope styles by default, global stores, and a familiar HTML, CSS, and JavaScript syntax with a little sugar on top for a great developer experience. SvelteKit gives you routing, API endpoints, loading data from a server and hydrating it, different rendering methods, serverless and edge functionality, and preparing a production-ready application for deployment. Create a new SvelteKit app with npm create svelte, or start straight in the browser with sveltekit.new. So now you know a little about Svelte and want to start using it. You can use Svelte to incrementally update any application. Like when I worked for Grainger, we used micro frontends to add in our components or sometimes entire sections to improve the user experience. Microsites and microservices are also great options. Svelte can also compile into web components to be used in other frameworks. They do have some limitations, though. The props come through as strings, and styles do not have the same scoping capabilities that they get in Svelte. And if all else fails and you can't use Svelte in your code base, try sveltosis.dev. This tool allows you to write Svelte code and then output it into the framework you're currently using. This is based on the mitosis framework, I guess you could call it, by builder.io, which is a JSX-based that outputs to any framework that you wish. But this one is based in Svelte, and then you can output to React, Vue, Solid, several other frameworks. And this has been Starting with Svelte. This is where your journey ends. So go give Svelte a shot on your next side project, or start adding it into your workflow now in some of the ways that we talked about, and see if you get hooked on it too. Thank you so much for your time again. I've been Brittney Postma, so feel free to let me know how much you're loving Svelte, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Brittney, that was fantastic. The first question I need to ask you, it was really, really, really good. You are such a natural at this. Not only did you teach yourself how to be a developer, how long have you been giving talks?
I have been giving talks for maybe 2 years. I started doing podcasts first, and I think podcasts really got me into that flow of like asking questions and being comfortable live talking. So I think that really helped a lot.
Oh, you're such a natural. It's awesome. We've got tons of great questions.
Awesome.
I know, and actually, you sort of answered one of mine, like right there at the very end. Maybe we'll get to that one later. But what the most probably the most requested one is about the difference. What's the big advantage that Svelte has over React?
So some of those slides that I had in the beginning, when I was at Grainger.com or at Grainger, we evaluated React and Vue and several other, I think Angular, Elm was one of the ones that we evaluated. And it was based on its performance, the lines of code, the simplicity. So actually being able to hire more of like a normal JavaScript developer gives you an even wider hiring pool sometimes than the React jobs. So that svelte.dev tutorial too, like can teach you those Svelte specific syntax really quickly. And then you can just actually use your JavaScript knowledge.
That's awesome. So what's in your journey with this, what was the biggest obstacle for you in migrating to Svelte?
in migrating to Svelte. So when I was teaching myself to code, I originally started with React, and everything was kind of pushing me in that direction because there's a lot of content out there, and that's not really a bad thing. It's just, for me, the mental overload of trying to write things in a function. I didn't know enough JavaScript at that time to tell what parts were React and what parts were JavaScript. So once I got to Svelte, I felt that familiarity. But some of the struggles that I did have are like the array and object methods that I mentioned. Those are some things that trip people up because Svelte's assignment is based on reactivity. So you need to make sure that your variables are getting reassigned to be updated by the UI.
And so to really get into that stuff, what's if you had to just pick one, what's the best way to start learning Svelte more in depth?
I think svelte.dev/tutorial really walks you through literally everything that Svelte gives you. So anything that's Svelte specific, you learn there. And then you can use your basic JavaScript knowledge. So I did free code camp to start, and then I took a React course. But then once I got into Svelte, I did the svelte.dev tutorial, and it allowed me to use my fundamental JavaScript knowledge to actually like learn more about JavaScript while I was in Svelte and using some of the framework niceties.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, you answered, or at least in a way, you really touched on this question. There were a few people asking about, the number of different frameworks out there, the challenge of bringing one into an existing environment. You touched a little bit on the refactoring that you can output in different ways. Any kind of rewrite is going to require buy-in from the management of a team, rightly so. So
yes.
What's the killer argument to get support to bring Svelte in to an environment that might already have other frameworks in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had some slides on this and they actually got cut just to make sure that I was within the time. But I think that you need to be kind and empathetic. I think that you need to speak in their language. So you need to speak in like profit and what you're gaining, not what you're losing. And I think that you need to make sure that it's kind of convince them that it's their option, maybe doing some developer surveys, like getting what the developers want and then taking it to the company. There's lots of different ways, but then there's also different ways to just use Svelte and incrementally update, like I mentioned. So you can use them as web components. You can use them in micro front ends or micro sites, and just little ways to start adding it in.
And so for a team, I mean, everybody's on React these days. What would what would you see as a good way to experiment then, and kind of just try something out there without having to go wholly into a different direction?
Experiment and try things out without going into a different direction. So maybe if you do the svelte.dev tutorial and you know enough Svelte syntax, that sveltosis.dev is really cool. Mitosis is the builder.io product I was talking about, and it allows you to write more JSX centric. So if you're in React and you know JSX, you could actually just get it output into Svelte and kind of see what the differences are and how that changes. And then, or maybe even using sveltosis.dev then to like see how that goes back and forth.
That's great. Thank you. So, I think one of the other, well, actually, there's a couple other things. I mean, we still have 10 minutes, so we're gonna get to a lot of questions. What's one SvelteKit versus just Svelte? Can we touch on that again? And
absolutely.
What the differences are?
Yeah. So Svelte is the single page app framework. So it's a SPA, or client side rendered. Everything is pushing the JavaScript to the browser and running the JavaScript inside the browser. On SvelteKit, you get more options with that. You can do a fully client-side rendered application in SvelteKit, but then you get routing and those API endpoints on top of it. But you can also choose based on your route between server-side rendering and static generation, or disabling JavaScript like I showed with the CSR. So if you turn CSR only on in dev mode, it sends 0 JavaScript to the client.
Wow, that's amazing. That's certainly that makes so much sense to me. It's one of my biggest frustrations is the amount of JavaScript that gets shipped to the front end with a lot of these frameworks, especially being someone who tends to be a little more focused just on the visual part and the front end performance. I mean, that's any time you've got 8 megabytes of JavaScript coming to your homepage, there's something there that maybe could be done differently.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about Astro, which I didn't even get to mention in this talk, but Astro is another way to use Svelte. So it allows you to write in all of those different code, and it ships 0 JavaScript by default. You have to actually turn it on in Astro. So that would be a good way to get started too.
That's awesome. So a more specific question that came in from Jadrian. I'm really sorry if I got that name horribly butchered. Does the JS logic have to live in the same file as the rest of the component in the script tags, or can you reference an external file? Any strategies to keep that code clean and easy to read?
Yeah, so you can use any of that externally. So you can create hooks like that. I talked about the alias to the lib directory, and that lib directory is where you would keep any files like that. So you can create maybe a hooks directory inside of that lib folder, and then you could create a utils folder, and those would be alias directly to that. So you do $lib/hooks or /utils and keep all of your utility functions and things in there. And those stores that I also talked about provide global state. So those could be a way to keep your state in sync and have variables stored in global state and then import it into the files that you need. So they don't need to live inside of that route.
Oh, that's interesting. I think that actually may be related to Jay's question about Svelte. How Svelte solves problems like sharing application state, and questions that I don't understand about prop drilling, global state, and context. I'm just reading what he wrote because I don't develop in either of them.
Well, I think that's a common problem that you come up with in React, because you either have to drill down props through multiple components to get down to that lower child, or you have to provide some context and providers to get access to your state that you need up in your parent component way down in this child component. So those stores that I talked about, Svelte stores, there's a writable, a readable, and a derived, and those allow you access across your application to those stores, and it keeps them in sync by using the subscribe method with that $ syntax. So you would reference the store with $ and then the name of the store, and that keeps it in sync across multiple components, routes, wherever you use it.
Awesome. How long has Svelte been around?
I think it started in 2015 or 16, but Svelte 3 was announced in 2019. And Svelte 3 is when Rich famously did that reactivity talk. I can't remember what the name of it is now, but it's like reframing reactivity or something along those lines. And he talked about like how being reactive is a little different in Svelte. And that's when Svelte 3 started becoming the new age wave of doing things.
Got it. And so I mean that's I mean these days that's a pretty good amount of time that's been around. I mean it's not something that is just brand new and going to be gone tomorrow. Somebody was Danilo was asking about will Quick replace Svelte, or at least conquer part of the dev's interest? I mean, I think you could be Quick. It could be anything. What is it that you think has the staying power for Svelte that really is different and unique?
Yeah, I think it is like a little bit older now. It's getting into that. There's like these inflection points that once a framework starts being used so much that maybe the developer experience or the usage goes down a little bit over time. But what we're seeing in the surveys is that the retention and people wanting to learn it is going up and up every year, and it's staying constant there. So it's been over time, like keeping up with that bar. And there's always going to be a new framework. Every day of the week, I feel like we have a new JavaScript framework, and Quick is really interesting. I've actually had Mishko on one of my podcasts and talked to him about writing Quick, and It seems very interesting. I just don't know if it's going to catch on and be kind of the new
Mhm.
wave. But Ryan Carniato's at Netlify now too. He's writing Solid.js, which is using some of these compiler techniques into JSX. And so this seems to be like we're going back to that older server-side age of JavaScript again, where we're swinging that pendulum back to the older way of things. But it's more like it's not the old way of doing it. We have all of these new technologies and new things that we can use along with it. So it's the old way, but better.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Looking at this from the other perspective, what is it that I mean? The question from Ibeth was about what can React do at the moment that Svelte can't do, but I would say ask it more broadly, not just React. Maybe it's Angular, maybe it's something else. What is it that you think is really most needed in Svelte to be competitive with whatever other framework that might be?
I think that the maintainers are doing a very good job of taking, like, they put RFCs up, requests for comments up, as soon as they're going to make an API change, and they ask for the community involvement. And I think that's one of the things that I love about Svelte is that the community is so giving and helpful and amazing. And so they will help you do anything. And as soon as there's a request for comments, they're giving their feedback. And it's just like my job as a developer experience at Netlify. Our community gives that to the Svelte framework. And if there's something that we're missing, go put an issue up. Like, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. The things that I can think of that I know, server-side rendering in React has been a thing for a while. If you don't use Next.js, it's very hard to get server-side rendering done. But I can't think of anything the other way that we're actually like missing right now. I'm sure
Mhm.
there are things, and maybe Quick and the way Quick does things with islands architecture. We don't have islands architecture. So some of that where you could actually like hydrate only pieces of your page rather than, and Remix has nested routing. So we have layouts, but we don't really have nested routing the way that Remix has nested routing. So those are maybe a couple of things that I would like to see in Svelte.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting. Thanks for digging into that. While we still have a couple of minutes left, there's still one or two questions here, but I guess what I wanted to touch upon was something you just mentioned there about participation, because this is
Mhm.
something that is one of those running themes, I think. Rachel has talked about this in the past. Uh, when something is not present or doesn't work the way that you think it should, and this is a PSA for everybody attending. We've got almost 1,000 people here. We get the chance to speak up, and so you've mentioned the community here. I know Rachel has mentioned all the participation from on the W3C is on GitHub. So we've all got GitHub accounts. We've all got all these different developer accounts. It's up to us to actually speak up when things aren't doing what we think they should be doing. Um,
100%.
yeah, when did you learn that lesson? When did you feel bold enough to speak up?
So I got very lucky, I feel like. And when I say lucky, sometimes people are like, you didn't get lucky, you worked hard. But I found this amazing community to start. And I did that React course I talked about that I did in the beginning when I was teaching myself to code was from Zero to Mastery Academy. And they have this global Discord server that has 360,000 people in it. So it's a massive Discord server. There's constantly questions being asked. And I started answering people's questions in there. And that actually started helping me learn. And I became a star mentor in that community. And they have like a hackathon every Hacktoberfest. We're in Hacktoberfest right now. And I was able to be on the maintainer side of that and actually like review pull requests and merge it in. And so it kind of taught me that process and like how valuable those things are, because submitting your first PR is terrifying for everyone. I feel like it's one of those things that's not familiar, and unfamiliar things just scare you by natural causes. But that walked me through that process and allowed me to get over that fear that, oh, if I do something wrong, it's fine, we'll revert it, it doesn't matter, you're not affecting a live production code, you're going to break something. But I feel like that is so important to have. Like, the Discord community was great for me, and then being able to walk through those processes of being a maintainer too.
That's fantastic. I hope everybody else is as impressed with what you've done, and with what you're highlighting. in terms of just being a part of the community. When you're a page ahead, help somebody who's a page behind. And I think that's a really wonderful lesson to really reinforce with folks, that you always have something to share. As we are kind of, I guess, wrapping up with the time that we have, one last question in the chat. This was from Jeremy, who has been going back and forth with me with font jokes all day. He's pretty bold with them, I'll have to say. But he's saying that. Yeah. Well, if we were Sans a comic, I wouldn't be here. Sorry. So Svelte compatible plugins, helpers that would aid migrations that rely on things like simple Apollo. So Apollo is replaced by simply using fetch. What are the things that are going to help people move from one to the other?
From like a GraphQL to being able, so SvelteKit focuses really on like those web standards. So you're going to be able to use a lot of the things that you already know from JavaScript. If you have good JavaScript fundamentals, you're going to be able to apply those and use those in Svelte. So you're going to be taking something you already know and then just applying it in the Svelte way. So once you go through that svelte.dev tutorial, kind of learn some of the fundamentals of SvelteKit, you'll be able to just use your JavaScript knowledge, I feel like, is the answer to that question. Specific GraphQL stuff, I haven't done a lot of GraphQL inside of SvelteKit, so I can't answer that question. I did see that was one of the things Svelte's talked, or Scott Tolinsky's talked several times about their migration from React, and he's got YouTube videos, he's got Svelte talks on it that he's done. So go and watch those, or maybe just ping him in the Level Up Tutorials Discord. He's really responsive in there, and ask him how that Apollo migration and GraphQL works, because he's got jQuery, I think is his new package that he uses for Svelte.
Awesome. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Brittney, you are a light. It is so nice to have you here. I'm good to meet you.
I'm so honored. Thank you too.
Well, look, this has been great. Hopefully you'll be around. People can ask you some